So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's screening and discussion of Caring Corrupted, the Killing Nurses of the Third Reich. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now in its 25th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice and war. Thank you for joining us today virtually. We hope you will visit the museum in person to see our new core exhibition, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, alongside our temporary exhibition, Survivors, Faces of Life After the Holocaust, from photographer Martin Scholler, which is running through June 18th. You can learn more and find tickets on our website. We also appreciate the vital support of our members so much here at the museum. If you want to get closer to the museum and enjoy exclusive programs, member previews to exhibitions, and free admission, you can explore museum membership on our website or email membership@mjhnyc.org to learn more. Closed captions are available on today's program. Instructions on how to turn captions on or off will be posted in the chat, in addition to all the links I've mentioned. So we're going to start today by watching the film, and then we're going to move into discussion afterwards. So if you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the discussion. Today, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Patricia Stark, Dr. Kathy Rosmus, and Dr. Joseph J. Finns. Dr. Stark, PhD and Dean Emerita of the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston Cizik School of Nursing, was dean for over 30 years. Dr. Stark retired as the dean in 2014, but continued her role as senior vice president of the university at request of the president until she retired in 2016. Dr. Stark worked in the field of human suffering and joined with other healthcare professionals in the Texas Medical Center to help ensure that today's students understand the part that nurses, doctors, and others played in the atrocities of the Third Reich as a cautionary tale. Dr. Rosmus is the Partners Professor and Vice Dean of Academic Affairs at the Cizik School of Nursing of the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. She is also faculty associate in the McGovern Medical School's McGovern Center for Humanities and Ethics. She's previously served as a dean of the Georgia Southwestern State University School of Nursing. Dr. Rosmus was the vice president for academic affairs at Georgia Southwestern for 7 years. Dr. Rosmus's research includes health behavior decision-making and cancer symptoms. Her most recent research has been focused on ethics education for healthcare professionals. Dr. Joseph Finns is the E. William Davis Jr. MD Professor of Medical Ethics at Weill Cornell Medical College, where he is a tenured professor of medicine and chair of the Ethics Committee of New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center. At Yale Law School, he is the Solomon Center Distinguished Scholar in Medicine, Bioethics, and the Law, and a visiting professor of law. The author of over 500 papers, chapters, essays, and books. His most recent book is Rights Come to Mind, Brain Injury, Ethics, and the Struggle for Consciousness. Dr. Finns is an elected member of the National Academy of Arts and Sciences and by royal appointment an honored academic of the Royal National Academy of Medicine of Spain. Professor Finns is president of the International Neuroethics Society, a past president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, and chair-elect of the Hastings Center Board of Trustees. Dr. Finns is a trustee emeritus of Wesleyan University, which has recognized him with an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters. Before we begin, I would also like to thank Linda Craze at UT Health Houston Cizik School of Nursing for all of her help putting this program together. So thank you so much for all of you joining us today.
Thank you, Sydney, and thank you to the Museum of Jewish Heritage for doing this very important program, and to our very special guests, Kathy Rosmus and Patricia Stark. I've seen this movie several times, and every time I'm more and more disturbed by it, and the lessons just keep on coming out. But I want to just step back for a second and ask Patricia about the motivation to make this film. As important as it is, there are very few films about nurses and very, very little about nurses in the Holocaust. What was the inspiration for you to get involved with this film?
Well, I think there were two main reasons. The first stemmed from my interest in the Holocaust based on my association with Dr. Viktor Frankl, who was a Jewish psychiatrist in 3 of the prison camps, I think over a 4-year period. And his work and his theories of how does one cope with a fate like this and move on in life and find meaning and purpose. And this was very relevant to me in the work I was doing with spinal cord injured patients, most of whom are young men, or many of whom are young men, who have a devastating injury and then their life is completely changed and they need a new direction in life. So my work with Frankel, I think, led me to the general area of human suffering and how do nurses fit into this? What is their role and what can they do to alleviate human suffering? So that's how I really got interested in this whole area of the Holocaust. The second factor at the time was there was a severe nursing shortage, and I think, we think there's always a nursing shortage, the recent strike in New York and so forth. But this was a time when the ICUs and other places were desperate for more nurses. The school was trying to produce more nurses as fast as we could. And we saw the pressures on nurses, the vulnerability when you don't have enough workers and you have more patients than you can care for in a quality kind of way. And you have to make choices and you have to set priorities. And you have to let some things go undone. You have to take shortcuts. This was causing burnout in nurses. And we began to see how this affects the ethics of nurses. And some of the stories and things we were hearing from the students disturbed us greatly. And we felt like, because the young people, as we said in the documentary, don't often know the details of the Holocaust and nurses' roles, we thought it important to bring that history to our students in the study of ethics. And we thought it a good way to make a documentary that we could share not only with our own students, but with students throughout the Texas Medical Center, medical students, dental students, and others, as well as across the nation. So I think that was our motivation.
Can I go back to Viktor
Yes.
Frankl for a moment? Because, by the way, for folks at home, posted, and we'll send out a list of resources, but Patricia did an interview with Viktor Frankl, I think it was in 1985, when she was dean at the nursing school. That is extraordinary. And I urge everybody to watch it. It's really uplifting. And one of the things that struck me was we have nurses in the camps falling prey to our worst instincts, and Viktor Frankl espousing our very best selves, finding meaning in the face of perhaps imminent death, that every day was meaningful, everything was worth doing, even if, as he said, it will be all in vain. That was what he said in the interview to you. The juxtaposition of Viktor Frankl as a prisoner, a psychiatrist prisoner, and a nurse staffer in the same place at the same time. It's just a kind of a moral juxtaposition, no?
Yes, I think it is. It is. And I think Frankl taught us in his logotherapy that we still use widely today, that you can find meaning regardless of circumstances. And a lot of it is the attitude that you take. And his famous saying that they can take everything from you but one, and that is your ability to choose your attitude toward it.
Right, and that includes your professional comportment if you were a doctor or a nurse.
That's right.
Kathy, I said to Patricia that there's a lot about doctors in the Holocaust, and there was a doctor's trial. We heard about that, but the nurses have been overlooked. How come?
I think part of it is the nurses were the invisible workforce who were behind the scenes making the things run, assisting in what was happening. They weren't the high profile people that were getting all the attention like Mengele, so they weren't as well known. They also thought they were just doing their job. And I don't know about the Germans back then, but my parents' generation pretty much thought nurses just do what you're told and there's not much critical thinking. So it's not, if you're just doing what you're told, so you're not really responsible for the horrible things that you did. So they weren't as visible, they weren't as well known, and probably people didn't think of them as being more free agents, having the agency to say, no, I'm not going to do that. Dr. Benedict looked to see what happened to nurses who refused. And of the few who refused, the worst punishment anyone got was being sent to the kitchen to work. So, we use the excuse, maybe they were afraid they would die or be killed if they didn't participate. But if your worst punishment's being sent to the kitchen, that's not a big punishment.
But they were conditioned to believe that they had to obey in that role.
Correct. Yes.
So is one of the things you're teaching nurses? Now we have the right-sided kind of surgery, and nurses have an option to say stop the infusion, stop the surgery, to actually give nurses the kind of agency that allows them to exercise choice and to be an actor clinically and morally in the clinical setting.
Correct. That's a large part of nursing education. Most people think nursing education is about doing tasks, and that was the way it was in the early days. Now it's all about critical thinking and making important decisions and being the person who speaks up for the patient. So whether it's the OR, as you mentioned, whether it's the drug transfusion, that the nurse is the lifeguard. He or she's the one there to protect the patient from any medical errors or anything unethical that he or she sees going on in the clinical.
Patricia, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I think this was very much a factor with our young students, and there's a concept called psychological intimidation.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Texas Medical Center, and I'm sure many places, even in rural hospitals, the physician is king or queen, and a nursing student would be very hesitant to question, even much less to criticize one of these figures that they are so intimidated by. So we needed to have the students fortified, if you will, give them courage that it's their responsibility to speak up when they see things that are not right.
How effective are movies like this? I mean, when the rubber hits the road, and you're the nurse in the OR, or you're an intern in a hospital, and you've seen this movie and you're taught to talk back and speak up, not to talk back, not to be inappropriate, but to speak up for something you think is wrong. Is this enough to give people moral courage? I saw Cornel West last night on TV, and he was saying the key virtue is courage, because it makes all the other virtues possible. We're talking about courage. Even if you end up in a kitchen,
Right.
you still need courage. How effective is this kind of movie? Is it enough? Do we need a booster shot? Is this enough of an inoculation, to borrow a metaphor that's too present?
Well, I'll tell you a couple of things that happened at our school. Because we had the nursing shortage was due to a nursing faculty shortage. We asked if there were retired physicians who wanted to come in and help us teach, particularly health assessment to nursing students. And we had a pretty sizable group of physicians who volunteered. They came in, they did not only that, but they helped the students with situations like you're describing. Mm-hmm. And they helped the student. This is the way you approach the doctor when you see something you want to question. This is the way that you talk to doctors, and this is the way you need the courage to speak up. So that was very, very helpful to our students. The other thing, we had some seminars, and Dr. Benedict was able to bring Trouda LaFran's Page, who had been a member of the Medical Student Association, the White Rose.
And just tell our audience what the White Rose was.
The White Rose was, as far as I understand, a medical student organization who was very opposed to what they saw going on, and they were trying to raise public awareness about it. And they had leaflets that they distributed, and the Nazis did find out about it and arrested two of the leaders, the medical student leaders, and they were executed, I think, within 24 hours. Well, Trouda LaFrenz Page was one of the students in Munich at the time, and she was arrested and actually, I think, served a year in prison. But she talked to the students, and the students said, how did you have the courage to do this when you knew how dangerous it was? And what she answered was, it was the right thing to do. And I had a student, when she left that lecture, say, I'm going to speak up. If I see something wrong, I'm going to speak up about it. So I think she got inspiration from others that they seen with this kind of courage.
You mentioned Maria Stromberger in the film, the nurse that sought a transfer to Auschwitz because she was upset about what was going on, and she became an ally of the prisoners and the inmates. Did she? What happened to her in her life, and did she survive the war? And what happened to her?
She became ill while she was at Auschwitz and was hospitalized. When she was released, there was the rumor that she was addicted to drugs, and then so she was transferred out. There were prisoners who believed that that was made up because they feared that the authorities had found out that she was helping the resistance, and that the physician who was taking care of her made up the drug addiction story to save her life and get her out of the camp. And then she did survive the war, and she did live until I think the 70s or so. So she did make it.
Did she think she was a hero, or did she just Patricia just said, just thought she was doing the right thing?
I think she was one of the ones who just thought she was doing the right thing.
Yeah. It's really interesting because you're talking about a nurse who would speak up, and she felt that she had done the right thing. There's a wonderful book called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed by Philip Halley, who was a philosopher. He was an infantryman in World War II. He was interested in cruelty, and then he stumbled upon the story of Le Chambon-Sur, which was a town of French Huguenots that sheltered Jewish children and saved hundreds of them. And he moved from being interested in cruelty to being interested in goodness and hospitality. And when he went back and there was a PBS documentary for folks who want to, Google this, and the book, of course, he asked these people who everybody else thought were heroic. You put yourself at risk to save these children. You're Huguenots, they're Jewish. Are you heroes? They said, no, we were just doing the right thing. So it's interesting because it seems to be a common theme. I want to go back, Kathy, and ask you more about just how nurses have been overlooked, and ask you about gender and power dynamics. Is that part of why the nursing story wasn't as prominent, perhaps, as the doctor story, which of course were predominantly male?
Correct. The majority of the nurses were female. There were more male nurses at the psychiatric hospitals. The interesting thing is at Hadamar, they arrested 3 nurses. The female nurse was the chief nurse, and then the 2 male nurses. They executed the 2 male nurses, and the female nurse was put in prison and then released in the early 50s. So there was some gender differences, at least in that one trial, and sentences based on gender. So most likely, and I wonder if that's part of what happened at the trials too, because these were female nurses. And so people didn't expect females to speak up. And particularly in Germany in that time, when the role of females was to be the wife and mother, not to be the professional who would stand up for their patients and do the right thing.
So again, getting back to that issue of agency, it wasn't even in society, much less in professional life. Another aspect of the film that's really very disturbing, and I've written a lot about disability rights and as it relates to brain injury, and Patricia's work with people with spinal cord injury, and just the origins of genocide in people with disabilities in Nazi Germany. Could you say more about that and the role of nurses in that sort of escalation of the tragedy? Patricia, or Murray, whoever,
Well,
Kathy.
I think even in the documentary, it emphasized how society was being influenced by all these statistics on the economics of keeping the handicapped alive. And that was during wartime when monies were needed for things other than healthcare on, as they said, useless eaters. So it was an economic thing. The economic welfare of the state was part of it. And then, as they said it, Oliver Wendell Holmes said 3 generations of imbeciles enough. So there was a widespread feeling that we do need to stop the proliferation of handicapped and impaired people. So I think it was a general societal issue as well.
You know, it's interesting because Nazi ideology sort of replaced Christian solidarity and communitarianism. I mean, you know, this is not a very Christian way of looking at our fellow man and woman. And I'm just wondering about the relationship of the churches and professional. A lot of nursing training programs are based in religious organizations. Were they different during the war? If you had a formation in a religious school and became a nurse, was it more likely to be protective of against some of these ideological concerns?
I don't think Susan found anything in her research that went back to the origin of the nurses' education and then how they acted in the war. The Christian nurses took their oath to be loyal to Hitler, just like the socialist nurses did. So they were all pledging, no matter what kind of school they went to, that their primary loyalty was to Hitler and to the Volk.
Let me ask some different kinds of questions about what the nurses actually did in the camp. I mean, you know, experimental things, but also medical care, and how did they interact with the prisoners, and what did they do?
Well, there were 2 types of nurses. There would have been the SS nurses like Maria Stromberger, and they were usually only taking care of the SS troops that were there. So they were there to take care of the Germans primarily. Then within the camps, there were prisoner nurses, and those were prisoners who would say, yes, I'm a nurse. And so they would be given the job of going to the infirmaries and taking care of the patients. And they were just like the prisoner physicians. They had no supplies, no drugs. They were just trying to keep people alive. And just like some of the physicians, they also helped to save lives of people by either hiding them or saying they didn't have typhus, they had something else so that they wouldn't be killed. So that they had many of the same ethical and moral decisions to make that the prisoner physicians had, none of which were good dilemmas that any of us ever want to be in.
Patricia, you want to add to that?
No, but I do want to go back to your former question. And I was remembering that when I was a nursing student, back in the late 1950s, 60s, one of our affiliations for psychiatric nursing was to be sent to Milledgeville State Hospital in Georgia, which I think was the second largest to New York, that was later dubbed Snake Pit. And there was a ward full of handicapped children that had hydrocephalus and cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, all of those things. And it was accepted practice that if you had a child born with this, you sent them to Milledgeville, to the state hospital for care. So it was really very embedded in society that it's not desirable to have these children. So I think there was prejudice underlying a lot of these decisions before we reached the end point of killing them.
There still is. In fact, there was a famous bioethicist named, who was a friend of mine. His name was Bill Peace, and he had an acquired spinal cord disorder and was in a wheelchair, and he subsequently died of poor medical care. But years before that, he was in the hospital with an infection, and a nurse came, and he wrote this up in the Hastings Center report. A nurse came by on the night shift, and she said, "I can help you. I can help you die." She honestly thought that she was doing him a favor, that anyone in that condition would not want to live in that condition. And Bill told her to get out of the room and leave him alone. And he wrote about it. He was a PhD anthropologist. But one of the things that I think is really important about this is about making a moral judgment about the value and the quality of someone else's life. And in disability rights, there's a saying, nothing about us without us. Don't assume you know how my life is going. Ask me, give me the opportunity to express myself. Don't make a moral judgment about the value of my life by proxy. And I think that's such an important lesson. And because I think one of the things about these kinds of movies is that you think, well, it's 80 years ago. That was my father's war. But it's a war we have to fight every day. Not to make the comparison to Nazi atrocities with current day, challenges, but there's that ever-present threat of going down that path in the wrong direction.
Right.
I think the recent example was what happened in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina at Memorial Hospital, where they had no power, no water, running out of drugs, no food. They evacuated their most well patients first, left their sickest, and then made the decision to overdose some of those patients.
Right.
So that's a very recent example of people going down that road.
So Kathy, that gets me to my very last question. I'm going to jump ahead, but I'll come back to the ones in the middle, because I was going to say, you guys made this film in 2015, 2016, and a lot has happened since then. If you haven't been reading watching the news, these are things that all relate to what happened in Nazi Germany, one way or the other. Let's start with the Muslim ban, COVID, separation of families at the southern border, the rise of fascism at home and abroad, and of course the rise of anti-Semitism and hate crimes, both here and abroad. Does this film it seem different now than when you were making it? 8 years ago. Is it feel different to look at it? You having different kinds of responses?
I will say students in my class draw the comparisons without any input, without me saying anything. They go there. The premiere of the film was in 2016 at the Holocaust Museum here in Houston. And there were several survivors there. And of course, that was the middle of the 2016 presidential campaign. And the survivors drew the comparison at that point when they were talking to me about what was going on politically within the country to what they and their parents experienced. So that was done early. It's hard for all of us. I gave you an example of when the children were separated from their parents at the border. As a pediatric nurse and a mother, that broke my heart. And I wanted to go take care of those kids. But then if I was able to do that, then do I become a part of the system that's separating the kids from their parents? And 20 years from now, is my picture going to be in the movie about here's the nurse who went to help separate the children from their parents?
How do we parse that out ethically? Is it harm reduction or complicity?
I think, first of all, it's for me thinking through those 4 bioethical principles that we all learned as medical students and nursing students, really objectively laying out all those, what's the autonomy, what's the benefits, the non-maleficence, and where's the justice and all of this. And then because of knowing the history, being able to think through at what point am I helping out and at what point am I becoming complicit in what it is. So it's being able to sit and look through that. Now, because I know the history, otherwise I can guarantee you I'd have tried to find a way to go to the border immediately and be with those kids. But then it came back to knowing what I know now. Does that make me a part of the problem if I get involved?
Right. So I think you're saying that history is so important, that whatever choice you make, it's going to be a more considered a better choice because you know your history and you can see where this possibly could go. If you were ill-informed about the history, you're just dealing with your own sort of intuitions, but not any kind of context, and that's important. Speaking of history, can you tell me anything about beyond the sanctions that some of these nurses had? Do we know if they ever had any kind of moral regrets that, that when they thought back on what they experienced and what they did, that they felt that they had done something wrong and evil? Did they have regrets? Did they understand what they did?
The transcripts from some of the trials, particularly the nurses in the 60s who had had plenty of time to process what they did, they readily admitted what they did. They thought they had done the right thing for the circumstances they were in. Now, we've only know about a few of the nurses. We don't know about the vast majority. And maybe it's that vast majority that had the regrets and don't want to talk about it because of the feelings of guilt. How did I get myself in this situation? How did I participate in this? So we may know less about them simply because they didn't want to talk about it.
Right. And it's a sampling question. As far as we don't really know, but it's again why history and archival work is so important. We in the movie there was this notion of first I'll take somebody to the room and then I'll open the door and then I'll start these small steps that people can take and then before they know it they're deep into some kind of evil. Patricia, how do we know when we're taking those so small steps and avoid the next one, especially as you teach nurses and health professionals?
Yes, we talk to the students about the slippery slope, that you can start down and justify why you're doing something that you're not really doing anything wrong. And then it becomes, well, if you can help hold the child while we give the injection, then maybe you can give the injection. And we do try to warn the students that, once you start down a slippery slope, it's very hard to stop that slide. So I don't know what else we can do, but just to make students aware and try to have them analyze the situation and what is really going on here.
Have you had any of your students come back and years later tell you about experiences where they invoke this kind of education about the Holocaust and how it helped them be better nurses in their lives or help them avoid errors that they would later come to regret?
We haven't heard from alum who reported on how they're using it in their practice. But several years ago, one of our students was interviewed by a newspaper from New York about what she had learned in the class. And she said what she had learned was that every decision you made, there was an ethical component, including which patient do I see first in the morning. So I thought she's got the big picture now. She's seeing that the little things we do, there's an ethical component. Everything we do throughout the day, we need to be looking at the ethics of our actions.
One of the things that came up during the pandemic was the public health and the well-being of individuals, and the move towards a kind of utilitarian ethic to save the most numbers of people, which in many ways is not dissimilar to letting the Volk thrive in its own way. What about words like population health, which is a phrase that's being used, versus the dignity or individual worth of the individual, and the relationships that doctors and nurses have to individual patients versus to the collective? Has this movie, this experience, this knowledge you have refracted your thoughts about the pandemic a little differently?
Well, I think that it makes us ponder when we think about population health and the similarities to health of the vote, health of the state. And these questions come up, for instance, the new drug that came out that cures hepatitis C. And it's like, well, there's a present population with, a lot of cases of hepatitis C. Do we spend the money on giving them the drug, or do we spend the money on something else? I think how we spend our money on healthcare, these kind of ethical issues arise all the time. Do we give free healthcare to immigrants crossing the border who are unhealthy, may have TB, and may give TB to children in the community? Or do we say, because you're an immigrant, you don't get health care paid for by the US? So these kind of questions come up, I think, a lot. And public health people debate this too as well. And I don't think we've come out with any principles that would guide us. We're just kind of having to look at individual situations.
Kathy?
Well, I think the pandemic brought out a whole bunch of ethical issues of the population versus the individual that we haven't really talked about publicly until the pandemic. It also made the ethical principle of justice much more in the forefront of how do we give just, equitable resources. And I don't think we found answers to many of those because they're complicated issues. Who gets the vaccine first? That one seemed to be fairly easily answered. We'll give it to the healthcare workers, so then they're healthy to take care of others first. Who gets the ventilator is another decision. Do we spend resources on ventilators versus vaccines? Public health versus the health of the individual. I wish we'd come up with a bunch of answers. I think we came up with more questions during the pandemic, and much of the uproar that we're still living through about the pandemic is that tension between the rights of the individual and the health of the population as a whole.
Right. I mean, I think, beneficence and justice and health equity probably suggests a way where we can take care of individuals and promote the collective well-being. And certainly with an infectious disease, the health of individuals affects the population's health, right? Because if someone is sick or a segment of your community is sick, everybody else is at risk. But I think, you could see the misuse of ideas of public health in the Nazi ideology. And those are the kinds of things we would want to avoid. And of course, if Nazi racial hygiene was about health inequity to the point of depriving and actually killing people that they thought were lesser beings. But I think it's very interesting to look at this movie refracted against these recent events. Because it just shows the ongoing relevance of the history. Kierkegaard, said life is lived forward and it's understood backwards. We were just going through the pandemic. We're going to understand it better in retrospect, but we have history to call upon to help us understand something that we now understand. We understand that history better than we do necessarily our current challenges. So history can really be a very important guide. Can you, in a few moments, what I'd like to do is to give Sydney a chance to bring in some, I know we have some questions from the audience, but I just want to ask if you have anything else you want to share about your reflections on the film that we didn't get to, that you think is important for us to hear.
I'd like to go back to a question you asked earlier. Is the film enough?
Yeah.
And my answer would be no. The film is the hook to get ethics to be something more than just a dry course where we talk about here's principles, here's hypothetical cases, and it's all usually about end of life issues. This is a hook that draws students in and makes them interested in ethical dilemmas and how we can work through them for ourselves. So my answer to that is it's the hook, and it needs further discussion, exploration, and looking at other things that happened in history that aren't as bad as this, but weren't particularly our best efforts as nurses and physicians.
Patricia?
Well, I just want to say that there was a great deal of interest in what we were doing in our own community. And from that standpoint, we were able to get donors who helped fund this film, and we're very grateful to them. There were other people in the Texas Medical Center, physicians and others, who are also involved in this work and very interested in this topic, who were our collaborators, supporters. And I do want to thank again Linda Craze, our project director, who really kept us on target and steered things and has helped us in getting it dispersed widely. So there are a lot of people involved in this project that we're very grateful to.
And we're grateful for our friends in Houston up here in New York to be able to do this together. Sydney, do you have questions that you want to share with us from the audience?
I do. So I think we'll kind of go in order in terms of the film, I think, and then sort of whichever ones kind of come in from there. So I wonder, you talked about how a lot of nurse training at this time, and I think medical training in general, was from churches and from church-based institutions. Do you know how the Catholic and, I think in the film you mentioned the Protestant church, do you know how they reacted to, personnel being trained by their institutions being involved in the killings? Do you know if they ever commented on that at all?
To my knowledge, no. And maybe this is an area that we have not explored enough to know yes or no to the answer to that question. But I haven't seen anything in the literature, and I don't know that this subject has been broached. Maybe Kathy knows something.
I don't know as far as training of nursing, but we do know there was an uproar, and it included a sermon by a Catholic bishop in Germany, von Galen, that caused the uproar in the community that helped to stop the T4 program, which was the killing of the psych patients. So that was a part of the history, and what happened was not directly related to the nurses themselves and their education, but was related to what they were seeing happen.
And I would just add that more generally, Pope Pius has been criticized for his complicity in not speaking out against the Holocaust in general, not necessarily the nurse's role, but in general. And there's a recent biography of him that got into some Vatican archives, where there were debates about how much they should speak out or if they should speak out at all. So it's not necessarily a flattering portrait of what happened there.
Right. So then, the film kind of starts by telling us that a lot of these programs were started by being performed on children. Did the parents know what was happening to their children once they were placed in institutions? And, if they didn't, what were they told after their children had died?
The first child that was killed, the parents, and it's debated whether it was the father or the grandmother, asked Hitler if he could have the child put down. So the one was actually at the request of the family. And reading autobiographies of people who lived during that time period, one woman talked about her brother was in an institution and he was doing okay. And she said, they said he died of pneumonia, but she didn't understand how that could have happened because he was doing fairly well when she had seen him recently. So I think there were rumors of what was going on, if not direct knowledge, what was happening with those kids.
So then as, Germany conquers other countries, goes into Poland, Hungary, all those other countries, do you know if there was a difference between how German nurses were viewed versus nurses in other countries? Were they did they become part of the effort? Do you know anything about that at all?
The only nurses that I know of who weren't part of the German SS nurses who participated in things like the camps were the prisoner nurses. So I don't know of any recruitment of local nurses to work with the SS nurses. I don't know if Dr. Stark knows of anything.
No, I don't know.
Mhm.
These are
So
good
then-
questions that we have not explored.
That's a good research opportunity. Somebody should, we'll take notes and send them around. But then I think that kind of feeds into this next question. Can you clarify a little bit more about what prisoner nurses were doing in the camps? I think this question specifically asked about Auschwitz, but I think in general, can you clarify a bit more exactly what prisoner nurses were doing?
So they would have been in the infirmaries and basically just giving comfort care because there were a lot of drugs. So they would have been giving comfort care to other prisoners who had injuries, who had typhus, who had other kinds of infectious disease. So comfort care basically there. They would have been helping people like Mengele do his research, do his surgeries. So they would have participated as nurses in those activities.
Mhm.
There are reports of physicians who participated in abortions while in the camps because they knew the mothers and the babies would be killed if the babies were born. I don't know if any nurses were actually involved in that as well. But it would be logical that if no more nurses and physicians than they were, that the nurses could have been involved in those kinds of things.
And
And
I
then
think we do know that there was some motivation for prison nurses to volunteer because they got to work inside instead of being outside in the cold. So there was some motivation, I think, to be in the role of a nurse and to probably go down this slippery slope of doing more and more things that were injurious to patients.
Right. And there's a bit of a follow-up question to that. Were nurses involved? You know, I know you said that they were involved in medical experimentation, but were they involved in the selection process of who went to the gas chambers at all? Or was that mostly physicians and Nazi officers?
In the camps, it was physicians, and there are records of some dentists who were doing the selections. There are no records of nurses that actually doing them. As far as the euthanasia program, during the T4, it was all done by physicians in the central office. In the wild euthanasia phase that happened after that, then the nurses were involved in helping to select the patients and recommending to whoever the group decision makers were for that hospital of who should be killed.
Gotcha. And then can you just talk a little bit more? You know, you talk a bit about the trials that happened, especially to the doctors and the nurses. But can you just go, I think, just kind of reinforce what was the outcome of those trials? If you can just kind of, I think it was discussed a bit in the film, but if you can kind of just reinforce what the outcome was.
So there were a couple of nurses at Meseritz who were tried and executed. And there were two nurses at Hadamar who were tried and executed. The other nurses that were tried early on after the war were given prison sentences. Then as time went on and they began having trials in the 60s, all of those nurses were basically found innocent, even though they admitted to what they did. So things changed over time.
Right. And can you also just clarify, you know, I know we talked a bit about gender as well, but can you clarify, were the nurses working in the camps, especially the ones who were involved in the killings and the medical experimentation, were those mostly women or was that men?
since the camps were usually divided into male sides and female sides, they had different infirmaries. So
Right.
there would have been women nurses helping who would be working in the women's infirmary and male nurses who would be working in the men's infirmary.
Gotcha. So then I think we can kind of move to the sort of implications for this. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here because we actually had a question about what happened in Louisiana during the hurricane, and we have a couple of questions about current U.S. healthcare ethics. So, do you feel that we live in a more ethical kind of healthcare system now, or do you think that we are, moving away from ethics in the way that our healthcare system works? Where do you see us as being currently?
I'll let Dr. Fins address this as well, but I would just say briefly before he talks, I think we have more infrastructure now around ethics than we had. When I was a new nurse, there were no ethics committees at hospitals. There was no infrastructure to help make these difficult decisions. So in some ways, there's more infrastructure. But with technology, there are easier ways that one can assist a patient in dying. So Dr. Fins.
Yeah, you anticipate. Thanks, Kathy. Joe, you anticipated what I would say. One of the legacies of the doctor's trial was the Nuremberg Code, and that is part of the infrastructure, along as Helsinki, and then the Belmont Report. And this is our ethical framework for the conduct of medical research. Interestingly, when the Nuremberg Code was propagated in 1947. During the trial, there are 10 principles about research ethics, including things like voluntariness. It's not just enough to get informed consent, but you have to be able to give voluntary consent. So if you're a prisoner in a camp, or if you're a prisoner or an inmate in a prison, and you're getting coerced into agreeing to something, informed consent is not enough. You have to be able to walk with your feet and say no. And that could also mean, economic coercion, like sign up for this protocol, we'll give you free healthcare. If you don't have healthcare, it's coercive. So these principles exist. But after the Nuremberg Code was written, people didn't think it applied to American doctors. It applied to Nazi doctors. Didn't apply to our context. And it wasn't until Henry Beecher wrote an expose in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1966, talking about some 20 plus research ethics abuses in the United States, and then the Tuskegee syphilis study, and then the writing of the National Research Act in 1974, which led to the Belmont Report, which led to the modern Institutional Review Board and the like. Having said all that, I think COVID was a stress test for our ethics, and it really got us into thinking about questions of health equity, fairness, justice, health disparities, that not everybody is similarly situated going into a pandemic, and their upstream challenges. If you had hypertension, if you were obese, you weren't getting primary care, you were more likely to die from COVID, whether or not you got a ventilator or not. So what happened at the hospital was important, but it wasn't necessarily determinative because it was an upstream injustice. So I think if we pay attention to what happened during COVID, we'll have to probably do time to reinvigorate our ethical framework. But it all starts really with this horrible history in Germany, and it starts with foundational documents like the Nuremberg Code. But it's the beginning; it's not the end of our discussions. So I think these are new kinds of challenges, and we just have to adapt to them and try to respond to them, and not be amnestic and forget. In 10 years, I bet you we're going to try to put this whole episode out of mind, like so many people have tried to deny the Holocaust. We're going to deny this pandemic and think, it's not relevant, but it is, and it should be. And we have to, and to really honor the people who died, and the doctors and nurses who cared so hard to care for us, to honor them. We have to honor their memory, and we have to honor the obligation to learn something from this. Very important.
I think one of the factors today that people worry about is how commercial medicine has become, and the threat of money decisions taking priority over ethical decisions. And that concerns a lot of people. And I think it's caused a lot of burnout with physicians and others that are just tired of having to get permission for things they know need to be done and then getting denied authorization. All those kind of frustrations, I think, certainly are affecting our ethics today.
So I think we have time for a few more questions. So Joe, you gave that very kind of comprehensive history of sort of what happens after the Nuremberg codes, I believe is what you called them.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? And, you know, Kathy and Patricia, please feel free to jump in. How does, you know, medical experimentation in the US, along with sterilizations and other kind of legacies, and I would say continuations of eugenics after the war in the US fit into that? Where, you know, where does that come from?
Well, one cannot be sterilized without one's consent. And you know, I think that's a legacy of the horrible story of forced sterilization. But more generically, for research, you know, medical research, a physician, an investigator has to have a valid hypothesis. It has to go through peer review within their institution, and then it has to go through an institutional review board, which is a body of your peers plus community representation. And an institutional review board looks at the quality of the science's ability to generate reasonable information. Like, one of the critiques of Nazi science was that it was just bad science. It was, you know, it wasn't good science at all. So you want to have good science, and then you also have community representation. On that, by federal law, the IRB has to have community representation to represent community values. It's not what a bunch of doctors and nurses think. It's what the community where your hospital or your institution is nested, whether they think this is an appropriate thing. They also spend a lot of time looking at the informed consent document to make sure that the person who's reading it can understand. And I think one of the more common reasons an IRB protocol is sent back to the investigator is to rewrite the consent, because it's not understandable. It should be written at a 7th or 8th grade level and not, you know, at a postgraduate level by the people who are writing it. And then all of these IRBs are regulated by the federal government. Or the institutions have a federal assurance, so the Office of Human Research Protections and the Office of Department of Health and Human Services. So if you're getting federal dollars, which is true for all medical schools and medical research institutions, you have to comply with these federal regulations. And now everybody who does research has to take courses and get certified every year or two in courses that are offered by groups like Primer. And I would just add that every one of these courses talks about the Nuremberg codes and talks about the Nazi doctors and those abuses. So, you know, that's part of the process that we go through now.
Joe, I
sorry, go
saw
ahead.
a question pop up. What is an IRB? You might.
Yeah, that's what I was just
Yeah,
gonna ask.
it's an institutional review board. It's kind of like an ethics committee, but it's not. And we distinguish clinical care, which is overseen by an ethics committee, with research, which is an institutional review board. And that's a very important distinction, the difference between research and therapy. And this is for research, so it's called an institutional review board.
So, and they look at, is your research going to be in any way harmful to patients? That's one of the things that an institutional review board would do.
Right. And things like making sure that people who are getting research understand that it's research and they don't suffer from what's called a therapeutic misconception. If something's investigational, it hasn't yet to be proven. So if you're getting a new treatment for a disease and it's not yet proven, not a treatment yet. It's an investigational therapy, but it's not a vetted therapy. And therapy is probably the wrong word. So these are nuances, but it's important because if people think they're just being treated, they won't understand that there may be heightened risk because you're dealing with the unknown, and that's why we're doing the study. And drugs come in different stages. So there's a lot that goes into it. All again, a legacy of this dark chapter in our history.
Right. So I think we have time for about 2 more questions. So Kathy, I believe it was you who mentioned the ANA earlier, and how I think you said that it has guidance power, but no sort of regulatory power. Do you think, and Patricia, I wonder if you also have an opinion on this as well, do you think that it's important for nurses to be able to kind of regulate themselves and be able to, do you think that would help create a more ethical profession?
So
Well, go ahead, Kathy.
The American Nurses Association is a professional group, and it's made up of people who join the organization, and they develop the code of ethics. Boards of nursing have some legal power, but most of their regulations are based on some incident that happened somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not based on the 4 ethical principles and based on patient care outcomes. It's more of a don't do this kind of regulation that you see. So in many ways, we as nurses do have to be self-regulatory. We do have to be able to report each other for unethical behavior, as well as report other healthcare providers. One of the things many states have done is they have legislated safe harbor, so that if I have a problem with the ethics of another nurse, I can safely report that.
Right.
So while they're not regulating the behaviors themselves, they're giving the infrastructure for the report to be made without fear of retribution.
Patricia, do you have anything you wanted to
Well,
add?
I was just going to say that I think the ANA leaves it to the state boards of nursing to whose mission is to safeguard patients. The safety of the patient is the reason the state boards of nursing and of medicine exist. And that's where you would find some regulation that would take care of problems.
Gotcha. So I think for our final question, I know in our conversations before, we've talked about how this film was made for, for nursing and medical students to watch and hopefully kind of learn from as well. But I would say probably most of our audience today is probably not healthcare professionals, just a guess. So what do you hope that people who aren't healthcare professionals, and if you do have a message for healthcare professionals as well, but what do you hope people in general, I suppose, take from this film?
Well, I hope that it raises the level of vigilance. I think we see this in hospitals today, that you really need a patient advocate to be sure everything is going well and to question things that are not, that don't seem right. So there are not enough nurses to go around. If we have a shortage, that we all need to be vigilant.
Kathy, do you have anything you want to add?
A couple of things. First of all, that the issues may start with someone else, but they may come back to you. It started with the children, then the psych patients, and then it expanded to the Jewish population, to other populations. So just because it starts with someone else doesn't mean it's not going to come to you. And then the influence of the world we live in, the political environment on healthcare, and decisions that individual nurses and physicians may be making, and what influence this wider part of the culture we live in can have on our decisions.
Joe, do you have anything? I don't want to leave you out.
Well, thank you. I think the erosion of liberties is insidious and freedom is insidious. And we have to know our history to know when we're in one of those perilous moments when it's all at threat. And this notion of the nurse taking a lot of little steps and all of a sudden they're in a different place, that's true for the body politic and for society at large. And it's very important that we remember, that Hitler was elected to be Chancellor of Germany, and it wasn't a coup. So we just need to be very cautious, and that's why the Museum of Jewish Heritage is so important, because it's a living reminder of this history. Because if we forget this history, sadly, we're going to repeat it, which is the last thing any of us really want to do.
Well, thank you to all three of you for this amazing discussion, and thank you to UT Health for providing such an amazing film. We're getting a lot of thanks in the chat, so I know a lot of people really appreciate it. So also to all of you who've joined us out in the internet verse, thank you for being with us today. If you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support and joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events.